They told me I was just there to check a diversity box, that my combat engineering experience was admirable, but the real experts would handle any serious problems. Then, the worst industrial accident in naval history struck our facility, and Admiral Jonathan Pierce's voice cut through the chaos. Is there a combat engineer here? In that moment, as debris fell around us and lives hung in the balance, every eye in that room turned to me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Warfare Center Crimson Ridge as Staff Sergeant Sienna Frost Caldwell adjusted her civilian contractor badge for what felt like the 100th time that month. 6 months into her new role as structural assessment consultant, she still felt the weight of skeptical stares whenever she entered a room full of active duty personnel. Her desert combat boots, polished to military standards despite no longer being required, clicked against the polished floor of the main administrative building with the practiced cadence of someone who'd spent 8 years perfecting that rhythm. The transition from active duty to civilian contractor had been jarring in ways she hadn't anticipated. During her deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, her expertise in combat engineering had been not just respected, but desperately needed. She'd been the soldier who could assess whether a building could withstand an IED blast, who could identify structural weaknesses that might collapse under enemy fire, who could jury-rig emergency fortifications from whatever materials were available. Her nickname, Frost, had come from her ability to remain ice-cold under pressure, making life-or-death calculations while explosions erupted around her. But here at Crimson Ridge, surrounded by peacetime protocols and bureaucratic hierarchies, that same expertise was viewed differently. She'd overheard the whispered conversations in the break room, the casual dismissals that followed her detailed structural assessments. "Sienna's thorough, I'll give her that," Commander Mitchell Kane had said just last week, unaware she was within earshot. "But she tends to overthink things. All that combat experience makes her see problems where there aren't any." Her small office in Building C was a testament to her methodical nature. Engineering manuals lined the shelves in perfect order, their spines marked with color-coded tabs for quick reference. Her desk held 3 monitors displaying real-time structural data from various facilities across the base, constantly updating with stress measurements, temperature variations, and material fatigue indicators. Most of her colleagues relied on weekly reports and scheduled inspections. Sienna monitored everything continuously. The wall behind her desk told the story of her military career through carefully arranged photographs and commendations. There she was at Forward Operating Base Chapman, standing beside a reinforced bunker she'd designed that had withstood a direct mortar hit. Another photo showed her team after successfully clearing an IED-rigged building that had claimed the lives of 2 previous EOD teams who'd approached it conventionally. Her Purple Heart sat in a small frame, earned when shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had torn through her left shoulder during a demolition operation near Kandahar. Yet despite these credentials, she found herself assigned to what amounted to glorified paperwork. Structural assessments for routine maintenance, as Kane had described her role during their initial meeting. Nothing too complex. We've got our senior engineers handling the critical infrastructure. Sienna's frustration wasn't with the work itself, but with the systematic dismissal of her insights. Last month, she'd identified microfractures in the support beams of Warehouse 7 that indicated potential failure under stress. Her detailed report, complete with photographs and stress calculations, had been filed away with a note that visual inspection shows no immediate concerns. 2 weeks later, a forklift operator noticed a slight sag in the ceiling that required emergency repairs, costing 3 times what preventative maintenance would have run. The pattern repeated itself regularly. Her recommendations for updating blast-resistant protocols were deemed unnecessarily militaristic for a peacetime facility. Her suggestions for improving emergency evacuation routes were considered overly complex for theoretical scenarios. Her proposals for enhanced structural monitoring systems were labeled cost prohibitive given current threat assessments. What stung most wasn't the professional dismissal, but the personal undertones that accompanied it. During her first week, she'd overheard Master Chief Petty Officer Arthur Stone explaining her presence to a group of junior officers. "New diversity initiative from Washington," he had said with the weary tone of someone discussing an unwelcome chore. "We're supposed to have more women in technical roles. She's got combat experience, which looks good on paper, but between you and me, there's a difference between field expedience and real engineering." The assumption that she was there to fulfill some quota rather than contribute meaningful expertise had followed her everywhere. When she'd corrected a calculation error in a foundation assessment, Petty Officer First Class Samuel Torres had joked, "Easy there, Frost, save some work for the rest of us." When she'd identified a potential contamination issue in the water treatment facility, Captain Harrison Webb had smiled patronizingly and assured her that our environmental team has everything under control. Most frustrating was the way her military experience was simultaneously acknowledged and dismissed. They'd nod respectfully when someone mentioned her combat deployments, but then explain why things work differently in the civilian world whenever she raised concerns based on that experience. It was as if her years of making life or death decisions under enemy fire somehow disqualified her from understanding structural engineering in a peaceful environment. Sienna had learned to adapt her communication style, presenting her findings with excessive documentation and diplomatic language that downplayed her certainty. Instead of saying, "This beam will fail," she'd write, "Indicators suggest potential structural concerns that may warrant further investigation." Instead of recommending immediate action, she'd suggest consideration of preventative measures during the next scheduled maintenance window. The military directness that had saved lives overseas was seen as abrasive in conference rooms filled with civilians and peacetime officers. Her coping mechanism had become even more thorough preparation. If they questioned her competence, she'd overwhelm them with competence. Her reports were masterpieces of engineering analysis, complete with multiple backup calculations, historical precedents, and detailed cost-benefit analyses. She arrived at every meeting with contingency plans for scenarios others hadn't considered, alternative solutions for problems they hadn't anticipated, and technical specifications memorized down to the decimal point. The other contractors had begun calling her the contingency queen behind their back, not entirely affectionately. They saw her meticulous preparation as showing off, her detailed documentation as implicit criticism of their more relaxed approach. "She makes the rest of us look bad," she'd heard one of them complain, "always going above and beyond like she's still trying to impress a commanding officer." But Sienna knew something they didn't. Her hypervigilance wasn't about impressing anyone or compensating for perceived inadequacies. It was born from the hard-learned lesson that the details everyone else ignored were often the ones that killed people. In combat, the IED you didn't spot, the structural weakness you didn't calculate, the evacuation route you didn't plan, those oversights had consequences measured in body bags. As she reviewed the morning structural data, sipping coffee that was still military strong despite her civilian status, Sienna noticed an anomaly in Building 12's stress readings. The numbers were within acceptable parameters, but they showed a pattern she recognized from her overseas experience. It was subtle, the kind of gradual shift that preceded catastrophic failure by weeks or months. She made a note to investigate further, knowing her concerns would likely be filed away with all the others. Outside her window, Naval Warfare Center Crimson Ridge hummed with routine activity. Personnel moved between buildings with the casual confidence of people who'd never had to wonder whether their next step might trigger an explosion. Ships moved in and out of the harbor with clockwork precision. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, and utterly under control. Sienna had learned to not trust appearances. In her experience, the most dangerous moments were often the ones that looked the safest. As she prepared for another day of having her expertise politely dismissed, she couldn't shake the feeling that all her preparation, all her ignored warnings, all her meticulous attention to details others considered unimportant was building towards something.
She just didn't know what yet.
The conference room in Building 1 buzzed with the controlled energy of a high-level briefing as Sienna entered precisely at 000 hours. Despite being a civilian contractor, her internal military clock remained unchanged. She carried a leather portfolio containing detailed structural assessments, environmental impact studies, and safety protocol recommendations she'd been preparing for weeks. Around the oval table sat the senior staff of Naval Warfare Center Crimson Ridge, a collection of officers and department heads who would determine the facility's infrastructure priorities for the next fiscal year. Admiral Jonathan Pierce commanded the room's attention from the head of the table, his weathered face bearing the kind of lines that came from decades of making decisions under pressure. At 62, he was a legend in naval engineering circles, having overseen the construction of 3 major naval facilities and the renovation of Pearl Harbor's dry dock systems. His presence alone elevated the meeting's importance, and Sienna felt the familiar flutter of nerves that came with presenting to senior leadership. Commander Mitchell Kane sat to the Admiral's right, shuffling through a stack of folders with the casual confidence of someone who'd been running these briefings for years. Kane was everything the Navy seemed to value in its peacetime leaders. Georgetown-educated, politically astute, and skilled at managing budgets and timelines. His engineering degree was solid, his administrative record spotless, and his ability to present complex technical information in digestible summaries had earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Pierce began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate attention. "Today, we're reviewing infrastructure priorities for fiscal year 2024. Our budget allows for significant upgrades to 3 major systems, with additional funds allocated for routine maintenance and emergency repairs." Sienna opened her portfolio and reviewed her notes one final time. She'd identified 17 critical infrastructure concerns across the base, ranking them by severity and potential consequences. Her analysis went beyond simple structural assessments to include blast resistance calculations, emergency evacuation protocols, and redundant system designs that reflected her combat experience. The presentation sheet prepared was comprehensive, methodical, and designed to prioritize human safety above administrative convenience. Kane activated the room's projection system and began cycling through his prepared slides. "Our facilities management team has identified the following priorities," he announced, highlighting a list of projects that made Sienna's stomach tighten with concern. First on the list was aesthetic improvements to the headquarters building, followed by upgrades to the officers' club and expansion of the recreational facilities. Critical infrastructure repairs appeared near the bottom of the list, categorized as routine maintenance items. With respect, Commander," interrupted Captain Harrison Webb from his position across the table, "shouldn't we prioritize the warehouse structural issues before we worry about landscaping?" Webb had worked with Sienna on several assessments and had grudgingly come to respect her technical competence, even if he questioned her communication style. Kane's smile was patient but dismissive. "Captain, our structural assessment team has reviewed all facilities and determined that no critical repairs are needed at this time. The issues you're referring to have been classified as preventative maintenance items that can be addressed during regular scheduled maintenance windows." Sienna's jaw tightened. The structural assessment team Kane referenced consisted primarily of civilian contractors who conducted visual inspections on quarterly schedules. They lacked both the equipment and expertise to identify the subtle stress patterns and material fatigue indicators that her continuous monitoring systems detected. More concerning, they lacked the combat experience that taught her to recognize how structures failed under extreme conditions.
"Admiral," Sienna said, raising her hand with the same crisp precision she'd used to request permission to speak during military briefings. "If I may, I've prepared a comprehensive infrastructure assessment that identifies several critical concerns requiring immediate attention." The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees as all eyes turned to her. Admiral Pierce nodded politely, but she caught the almost imperceptible eye roll from Kane and the suppressed smirk from Master Chief Petty Officer Arthur Stone. They were indulging her, allowing the diversity hire to have her moment before the real business resumed. "Of course, Miss Caldwell. Please proceed." Sienna stood and activated her laptop, connecting it to the projection system, with movements that betrayed her nervousness despite her best efforts to appear confident. Her first slide displayed a color-coded map of the entire facility, with red zones indicating critical structural concerns, yellow areas showing developing problems, and green sections representing stable infrastructure. "Sir, my continuous monitoring systems have identified 17 priority infrastructure issues across the base," she began, her voice steady despite the skeptical faces around the table. "3 of these pose immediate safety risks that could result in structural failure within the next 6 to 18 months. Kane leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone humoring a child's explanation of rocket science. "Ms. Caldwell, I appreciate your thoroughness, but our certified structural engineers have already conducted comprehensive assessments of all facilities. Their findings don't support your conclusions." "With respect, Commander, visual inspections conducted quarterly cannot detect the stress fracture patterns and material fatigue indicators that continuous monitoring reveals." Sienna advanced to her next slide, showing detailed stress measurements from Building 12. "These readings indicate progressive foundation settlement that's creating uneven load distribution across the primary support structure." Lieutenant Vanessa Gray, the base's official structural engineer, frowned as she studied the data. "These measurements are far more detailed than our standard assessment protocols require. Where exactly are you getting this information?" "I've installed supplementary monitoring equipment at key structural points throughout the facility. The data streams directly to my office, allowing real-time analysis of stress patterns, temperature variations, and material fatigue indicators." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Admiral Pierce's expression shifted from dismissive to annoyed. "You've installed monitoring equipment without authorization?" His voice carried the sharp edge of someone who discovered an unauthorized modification to his carefully controlled domain. "The equipment is non-invasive and doesn't interfere with existing systems. It simply provides additional data points that enhance safety assessments." Admiral Pierce held up a hand to quiet the room. "Ms. Caldwell, while I appreciate your initiative, unauthorized modifications to naval facilities raise serious security and liability concerns. We have established protocols for infrastructure monitoring that have served us well for decades."
Sienna felt the familiar sting of having her expertise questioned, but she pressed forward. "Sir, in Afghanistan, I learned that established protocols often fail when conditions change. The stress patterns I'm seeing in Building 12 match exactly what I observed before a forward operating base bunker collapsed near Kandahar. We ignored the warning signs because they seemed minor, and 3 soldiers died when the roof gave way during a mortar attack." The room fell silent. Bringing up combat casualties to justify civilian infrastructure concerns was either brilliant or catastrophically inappropriate, and Sienna wasn't sure which. Kane's face had shifted from annoyed to genuinely angry, while Admiral Pierce maintained his poker face but leaned slightly forward in his chair. "Ms. Caldwell," Kane said, his voice carefully controlled, "we're not operating in a combat zone. The stresses you encountered in Afghanistan simply don't apply to peacetime naval facilities. Your combat experience, while admirable, may be causing you to see problems that don't actually exist in our current environment." "Furthermore," added Master Chief Stone, speaking for the first time during the briefing, "unauthorized monitoring equipment represents a security breach that could compromise sensitive operations. I'll need a full inventory of what you've installed and immediate removal of any unauthorized devices." Sienna felt the walls closing in around her. Her technical expertise was being dismissed, her professional judgment questioned, and her methods criticized as inappropriate. The detailed analysis she'd spent weeks preparing was being reduced to the paranoid overreaction of someone who couldn't distinguish between wartime and peacetime conditions. "Sir," she tried once more, addressing Admiral Pierce directly,
The mathematical stress calculations don't change based on the operational environment. Steel and concrete behave the same way whether they're in Afghanistan or California. The loading patterns I'm observing will lead to structural failure regardless of whether that failure occurs during enemy action or routine operations. Admiral Pierce studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Ms. Caldwell, I appreciate your dedication to safety. However, we have established chains of command and approved protocols for good reason. Commander Kane's assessment team has the responsibility and authority for infrastructure decisions. I suggest you coordinate your concerns through proper channels rather than conducting unauthorized monitoring operations. The dismissal was polite but absolute. Sienna gathered her materials with as much dignity as she could manage, her face burning with the familiar shame of having her expertise reduced to overcautiousness born from combat trauma. As she prepared to leave, Kane delivered the final blow with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Caldwell, perhaps you'd be more comfortable focusing on your assigned duties rather than trying to redesign our entire infrastructure management system. We appreciate contractors who stay within their designated roles. As she walked back to her small office in Building C, she could hear the muffled laughter resuming behind the conference room doors. Another meeting, another dismissal, another confirmation that her combat-earned expertise was seen as a liability rather than an asset in the peacetime Navy's bureaucratic environment. But as she sat at her desk, staring at the continuous data streams from her unauthorized monitoring equipment, Sienna couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed something far more dangerous than her career prospects. She had seen what happened when leadership ignored technical warnings for political convenience. The only question was whether she'd get another chance to speak up before people started dying.
Over the following 3 weeks, Sienna watched her monitoring systems with growing alarm as the structural anomalies she'd identified in her dismissed briefing began accelerating. The stress readings from Building 12 showed a disturbing pattern of progressive deterioration, with load-bearing members showing increased deflection under normal operational weights. What had begun as subtle variations in her data streams was evolving into clear mathematical proof of impending structural failure. Her unauthorized monitoring network had grown more sophisticated since the briefing. Working during off hours and weekends, she'd installed additional sensors throughout the facility, creating a comprehensive real-time assessment system that tracked everything from minute foundation settlements to thermal expansion patterns in critical structural elements. The data painted a picture that kept her awake at night, checking and rechecking her calculations to ensure she wasn't making the kind of catastrophic error that could destroy her credibility permanently. Building 12 housed the facility's primary electrical distribution systems, water treatment equipment, and emergency backup generators. A structural failure there wouldn't just inconvenience operations, it would cripple the entire base's ability to function. More critically, the building operated with a skeleton crew during night shifts, meaning any collapse could trap personnel in areas where rescue operations would be nearly impossible. Sienna had tried the official channels first. Her detailed report to Lieutenant Vanessa Gray, complete with stress calculations and failure probability matrices, had been filed away with a polite acknowledgement and a suggestion that she focus on her assigned duties rather than duplicating work already being performed by qualified personnel. When she'd attempted to discuss her findings with Captain Harrison Webb, he'd listened patiently before explaining that continuous monitoring systems aren't part of our established safety protocols for good reason. They tend to generate false alarms that waste resources and create unnecessary anxiety. The dismissals weren't just professional. They carried personal undertones that made Sienna question whether her concerns were being evaluated on their technical merits or filtered through assumptions about her judgment. Master Chief Stone had been particularly direct during a chance encounter in the facility's main corridor. "Caldwell," he'd said, using her last name without rank or courtesy title, "you need to understand that this isn't Afghanistan. We don't need to fortify against mortar attacks or worry about IED explosions.
Your combat experience is creating problems where none exist. The suggestion that her wartime service had somehow impaired her ability to conduct sound engineering analysis stung more than the professional dismissals. Sienna had seen the aftermath of ignored warnings in combat zones, the forward operating bases that collapsed because someone deemed structural reinforcement unnecessarily paranoid, the supply depots that burned because fire suppression systems were considered overkill for the current threat environment. The mathematics of structural failure didn't change based on the source of the stress, whether it came from enemy mortars or simple material fatigue. Her isolation deepened as word spread about her unauthorized monitoring obsession. During lunch breaks, conversations would pause when she entered the cafeteria, resuming only after she'd found a table sufficiently distant to avoid overhearing the specifics of whatever discussion her presence had interrupted. Petty Officer First Class Samuel Torres, who'd initially been friendly during her first weeks at Crimson Ridge, now responded to her technical questions with barely concealed impatience and suggestions that she trust the system instead of trying to reinvent it. The psychological toll of being systematically dismissed was compounded by the growing certainty that her analysis was correct. Each day brought new data points that confirmed her projections, each structural measurement that fell further outside normal parameters, each calculation that brought Building 12 closer to catastrophic failure. She began having dreams about concrete dust and twisted steel, about voices calling for help from beneath debris that no one had predicted would fall. Monica Bell, the newest member of the facilities management team, provided Sienna's only sympathetic ear during this period. Bell had recently completed her master's degree in structural engineering and possessed enough technical knowledge to understand Sienna's calculations without immediately dismissing them as the paranoid projections of someone suffering from combat-related anxiety. During their informal conversations, Bell admitted that some of Sienna's findings troubled her, but she lacked the seniority to challenge established assessment protocols.
Sienna understood the political dynamics, but her combat experience had taught her that bureaucratic considerations became irrelevant once people started dying. She'd seen talented officers make catastrophic decisions because admitting error would damage their careers, and she'd seen enlisted personnel pay the price for leadership's unwillingness to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. The familiar pattern was repeating itself at Crimson Ridge, with potentially deadly consequences. Her attempts to document everything became increasingly desperate. She photographed hairline cracks in concrete supports that hadn't existed 3 weeks earlier. She recorded audio memos describing the subtle changes and structural vibration patterns that accompanied normal facility operations. She created detailed timeline projections showing how current stress rates would lead to critical failure within 6 to 8 weeks, assuming no intervention occurred. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very thoroughness of her documentation was being used as evidence of her instability. Commander Kane had made pointed comments during department meetings about contractors who become overly invested in theoretical problems, and Master Chief Stone had suggested that perhaps Ms. Caldwell would benefit from focusing on routine maintenance issues rather than conducting unauthorized research projects. Meanwhile, the official assessment team continued their quarterly visual inspections, finding nothing more concerning than normal wear and tear consistent with a facility of this age. Their reports, filed in triplicate and stamped with official approval, carried the institutional weight that Sienna's detailed technical analysis lacked. In the Navy's hierarchical structure, authorized incompetence outranked unauthorized expertise every time. The breaking point came during a routine facilities meeting when Kane announced plans to install additional heavy equipment in Building 12's main bay. The new machinery would increase the building's operational load by approximately 30%, well within the original design specifications, but potentially catastrophic given the structural degradation Sienna's monitoring systems had detected. "Commander," she said, raising her hand with the same precision she'd used during the failed infrastructure briefing, "the additional load could compromise structural integrity given current conditions."
Kane's response was swift and dismissive. Ms. Caldwell, our structural engineers have approved the installation. Your concerns have been noted and addressed through proper channels. Sir, the mathematical stress calculations clearly indicate, Ms. Caldwell, your unauthorized monitoring equipment and unsolicited analysis are not part of our official assessment protocols. I'm going to ask you one final time to focus on your assigned duties and allow qualified personnel to handle infrastructure decisions. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of machinery from the adjoining workshop. Sienna felt every eye upon her, some sympathetic, most simply uncomfortable with the tension between a junior contractor and senior command authority. She could push harder, risk her position entirely by demanding that Admiral Pierce review her findings, or she could retreat once again and hope that catastrophic failure would somehow be avoided. She chose retreat, gathering her materials with as much dignity as possible while Kane resumed his presentation about installation schedules and operational timelines. But as she walked back to her small office, Sienna made a decision that would define everything that followed. If official channels wouldn't accept her analysis, she would prepare for the consequences of their refusal. That evening, working long past normal business hours, she began drafting detailed emergency response protocols for Building 12's structural failure. She identified optimal evacuation routes, calculated debris patterns, and planned rescue operations for personnel who might become trapped. If no one would listen to her warnings about preventing the disaster, she would at least be ready to minimize casualties when it inevitably occurred. The next morning brought news that made her blood run cold. Building 12's overnight shift had reported unusual creaking sounds coming from the main support structure, described as more noticeable than usual, but not concerning enough to warrant investigation. Sienna's monitoring systems showed that the stress patterns had accelerated overnight, bringing her failure timeline from weeks to potentially days. She had run out of time for official channels and bureaucratic politeness. The only question remaining was whether she possessed the courage to take unofficial action when authorized inaction was about to kill people.
At 14:32 hours on a Tuesday afternoon that had begun like any other, the foundations of Naval Warfare Center Crimson Ridge shifted 3 millimeters to the northeast. The movement lasted exactly 2.7 seconds and registered on Sienna's monitoring systems as a sharp spike in stress readings across Building 12's primary support structure. What followed was a cascade of structural failures that would be studied in engineering schools for decades to come. Sienna was reviewing maintenance schedules in her office when every alarm on her unauthorized monitoring network began screaming simultaneously. The sound was unlike anything she'd programmed into the system, a discordant symphony of warnings that indicated multiple critical failures occurring in rapid succession. Her 3 monitors filled with red warning indicators as stress readings spiked beyond anything in her mathematical models. Building 12's main support beam, already compromised by months of progressive deterioration, finally surrendered under the additional load of the newly installed equipment Commander Kane had insisted on placing there, despite her warnings. The failure propagated through the structure like a zipper opening, each compromised element transferring its load to the next weakest point until the entire eastern wall began buckling inward. The first indication most personnel had of the disaster was a sound described later as like a freight train derailing in slow motion. The deep, grinding roar of concrete and steel separating from their intended configurations echoed across the base, followed by the sharp crack of support beams snapping under impossible loads. Emergency alarms began wailing from the automated fire suppression systems as electrical equipment sparked and died throughout the affected building. Seaman First Class Monica Bell was conducting a routine inspection in Building 12's basement when the collapse began. She found herself trapped in a pocket of space created by a fallen I-beam that had landed across 2 concrete pillars, creating a makeshift shelter that probably saved her life. Around her, the basement filled with debris, dust, and the acrid smell of electrical fires as power systems failed throughout the facility. In the main administrative building, Commander Kane felt the ground vibrate beneath his feet during what should have been a routine afternoon meeting about recreational facility improvements. The conference room's windows rattled in their frames, and several officers instinctively looked toward the ceiling as dust began sifting down from the acoustic tiles. What the hell was that?
Captain Harrison Webb asked, rising from his chair as the rumbling sound reached them even through the building's substantial construction. Before anyone could respond, Petty Officer First Class Samuel Torres burst through the conference room door without ceremony, his face pale and his uniform covered in concrete dust. "Sir, Building 12 has partially collapsed. We have personnel trapped inside and electrical fire spreading through the lower levels." The room exploded into controlled chaos as officers began barking orders and reaching for communication devices. Kane grabbed his radio and began attempting to contact emergency response teams, while Admiral Pierce immediately stood and began coordinating initial response efforts with the calm precision of someone who'd managed crises throughout his career. "Casualties?" Admiral Pierce asked Torres, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was hearing. "Unknown at this time, sir. The building's night shift was minimal, maybe 6 personnel total, but we can't establish communication with anyone inside. The collapse took out primary power to that section of the base." Kane's face had gone ashen as the implications became clear. Building 12 wasn't just another warehouse. It housed critical infrastructure that supported operations across the entire facility. More immediately concerning, the building's layout meant that anyone trapped inside would be in areas where conventional rescue operations would be nearly impossible. "Get me a structural assessment team on site immediately," Admiral Pierce ordered. "I want to know what we are dealing with before we send rescue personnel into an unstable structure." "Sir," Torres replied, his voice carrying bad news, "Lieutenant Gray is off base attending a conference in San Diego. Master Chief Stone is trying to reach our backup structural engineer, but he's on leave until Thursday." The Admiral's expression darkened as he realized their primary expertise for managing this crisis was unavailable when they needed it most. "What about our civilian contractors? Don't we have structural specialists on retainer?"
Kane cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, our primary contractor for structural assessments is Wagner Engineering, but their team is currently committed to a project at Camp Pendleton. They estimate it would take 6 to 8 hours to get qualified personnel on site." 6 to 8 hours. Admiral Pierce had enough experience with structural collapses to know that anyone trapped in the debris couldn't wait that long. Every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding survivors, and every hour increased the risk that secondary collapses would kill rescue personnel along with victims. "What other options do we have?" he asked, though the question carried the tone of someone who suspected the answer wouldn't be encouraging. The conference room fell silent as officers looked at each other with the growing realization that their carefully structured hierarchy had left them without the expertise needed to manage the crisis unfolding outside their windows. Their established protocols assumed that qualified personnel would be available when needed, that backup systems would function as designed, that catastrophic failures would occur during business hours when full staffing was available. Through the conference room's windows, they could see smoke rising from Building 12's ruins, the black columns indicating that electrical fires were spreading despite the automatic suppression systems. Emergency vehicles were beginning to arrive on scene, but their effectiveness would be limited without expert guidance about which areas were safe to enter and which sections remained at risk of further collapse. Admiral Pierce had commanded naval operations in 3 different combat zones and had managed crisis situations that involved everything from hurricane damage to terrorist attacks. But in those situations, he'd always had access to the technical expertise needed to make informed decisions. Now, facing a disaster that required specialized structural engineering knowledge, he found himself dependent on a system that had failed precisely when it was needed most. "Get me everyone," he said finally. "Every contractor, every engineer, every person on this base who has any relevant technical background. I don't care if they're janitors with engineering degrees or supply clerks who took construction management courses. We need expertise, and we need it now." Kane began making calls while other officers dispersed to coordinate emergency response efforts. Within minutes, personnel throughout the base received orders to report to the Emergency Command Center if they had any technical background related to structural engineering, construction management, or emergency rescue operations. The response was smaller than Admiral Pierce had hoped. A handful of junior officers with civil engineering degrees, 2 contractor personnel with construction backgrounds, and several enlisted personnel who'd worked in related fields before joining the Navy. It was a collection of individuals with relevant knowledge, but none possessed the specialized expertise needed to assess a major structural collapse and plan rescue operations in an unstable environment.
As the impromptu crisis team assembled in the conference room, Admiral Pierce studied their faces and realized he was looking at well-meaning personnel who lacked the experience to manage what they were facing. The junior officers had textbook knowledge, but no practical experience with structural failures. The contractor personnel understood construction, but had never dealt with collapse scenarios. The enlisted personnel possessed hands-on experience, but lacked the engineering background to assess complex structural damage. Outside, the smoke was getting thicker, and radio reports from the scene indicated that rescue personnel were afraid to enter the building without expert guidance about which areas remained structurally sound. Time was running out for anyone trapped in the debris, and every minute of delay increased the risk that recoverable casualties would become fatalities. "Sir," Kane said, hanging up his phone after another unsuccessful attempt to locate qualified personnel. "Wagner Engineering is trying to expedite their response, but their nearest team is still 4 hours away minimum. San Diego traffic is backing up their travel time." Admiral Pierce felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders in a way he hadn't experienced since combat operations. Lives hung in balance, and the decisions he made in the next few minutes would determine whether the people trapped in Building 12's ruins lived or died. He needed expertise he didn't have, time he didn't possess, and solutions that weren't immediately apparent. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same facility that had dismissed technical warnings for months was now desperately seeking technical expertise to manage the consequences of ignoring those warnings. But irony wouldn't save the people trapped in the debris, and regret wouldn't provide the specialized knowledge they needed. "Is there anyone else?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Anyone at all with relevant expertise.
The silence that followed Admiral Pierce's question stretched for nearly 10 seconds. An eternity in a crisis situation where every moment meant the difference between life and death for personnel trapped beneath tons of concrete and twisted steel. The improvised crisis team exchanged glances that carried the weight of their collective inadequacy, each hoping someone else would step forward with the expertise they desperately needed. Captain Harrison Webb broke the silence first. "Sir, what about the Army Corps of Engineers? Could we request immediate assistance through joint service protocols?" "Minimum response time would be 3 hours, Kane replied, consulting his emergency contact directory. "Their nearest rapid response team is stationed at Fort Irwin, and they'd need time to mobilize specialized equipment for this type of collapse." 3 hours. Admiral Pierce had commanded enough emergency operations to know that anyone trapped in Building 12's debris couldn't survive that delay. The structural collapse had compromised electrical systems throughout that section of the base, meaning no power for heating systems as afternoon temperatures dropped toward what promised to be a cold evening. More critically, medical emergencies required immediate intervention, and crush injuries could prove fatal within the first hour if victims weren't properly stabilized. "What about civilian emergency response?" suggested Lieutenant Vanessa Gray's replacement, a junior officer named Ensign David Martinez, who'd been hastily recalled from leave to assist with the crisis. "Los Angeles County has specialized urban rescue teams with structural collapse experience." Admiral Pierce shook his head grimly. "They're qualified for civilian building collapses, but military facilities have different construction standards and security requirements. We need someone who understands both structural engineering and military infrastructure specifications." The Admiral moved to the conference room's windows, studying the smoke and dust clouds rising from Building 12's ruins. Through the haze, he could see emergency personnel maintaining a perimeter around the collapse site, waiting for expert guidance that would tell them whether rescue attempts were possible or whether they'd simply be adding to the casualty count by entering an unstable structure. Radio reports from the scene painted an increasingly desperate picture. Emergency responders had detected voices from within the debris, confirmation that at least some personnel had survived the initial collapse and were calling for help. But without structural assessment, rescue teams couldn't determine safe entry points or identify areas where secondary collapses might occur during extraction operations. "Sir," Torres reported after receiving another radio update, "the base fire chief is requesting immediate expert assessment.
They're hearing at least 3 distinct voices from different locations within the debris field, but smoke from electrical fires is making conditions increasingly dangerous for anyone trapped inside. The weight of command never felt heavier on Admiral Pierce's shoulders. He'd commanded life and death decisions in combat zones, managed crisis situations that affected thousands of personnel, and commanded operations under impossible circumstances. But those situations had always included access to appropriate expertise. Engineers who understood the technical challenges, specialists who could assess risks and recommend solutions, technical personnel who could translate theoretical knowledge into practical action. Now, he faced a crisis that required specialized knowledge his command structure simply didn't possess. The carefully organized hierarchy that managed routine operations effectively created a single point of failure when that expertise became unavailable. Their system worked perfectly until it didn't work at all. Get me everyone on the space with any engineering background whatsoever, Admiral Pierce ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd run out of conventional options. I don't care if they're contractors, enlisted personnel, or civilian employees. If someone has a degree in engineering, construction experience, or any relevant technical knowledge, I want them in this room within 10 minutes. Kane began coordinating the base-wide call while other officers dispersed to various departments, seeking anyone who might possess skills relevant to structural collapse assessment. The response revealed the limitations of their current personnel, plenty of individuals with general technical backgrounds, but none with the specialized expertise needed to assess a major structural failure and plan rescue operations. Within 15 minutes, the conference room held everyone on base with any conceivable relevant experience. 2 junior officers with civil engineering degrees but no practical collapse experience, a contractor with extensive construction background but no military infrastructure knowledge, several enlisted personnel who'd worked in construction before joining the Navy but lacked formal engineering education, a civilian employee who'd studied architecture but had never dealt with structural failures. Admiral Pierce studied the assembled group and realized he was looking at well-intentioned personnel who possessed fragments of the knowledge he needed but lacked the comprehensive expertise to manage what they were facing.
Individually, they understood pieces of the puzzle: concrete behavior under stress, steel failure patterns, construction techniques, safety protocols. But none possessed the integrated knowledge necessary to assess a complex structural collapse and coordinate rescue operations in an unstable environment. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Pierce began, addressing the group with the gravity the situation demanded. We have personnel trapped in Building 12 following a major structural collapse. Emergency responders are standing by, but they need expert assessment before beginning rescue operations. Lives depend on decisions we make in the next few minutes. He gestured toward the windows where smoke continued rising from the collapse site. I need someone who can assess structural stability, identify safe entry points for rescue teams, and coordinate extraction operations in a potentially unstable environment. This isn't theoretical engineering. This is life and death decision-making under extreme pressure. The room fell silent as each person mentally inventoried their qualifications against the Admiral's requirements. The junior officers exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing that their textbook knowledge hadn't prepared them for this type of real-world crisis. The contractor personnel understood construction, but had never dealt with military infrastructure or collapse scenarios. The enlisted personnel possessed hands-on experience, but lacked the engineering background to make critical structural assessments. Admiral Pierce felt time slipping away as personnel trapped in the debris faced increasingly desperate circumstances. Radio reports indicated that smoke from electrical fires was thickening, meaning anyone who'd survived the initial collapse now faced the additional threat of smoke inhalation in confined spaces. Every minute of delay reduced their chances of survival and increased the risk that recoverable casualties would become fatalities. "Damn it," he said quietly, then turned back to the assembled group. "We're out of conventional options. I need someone who can assess that collapse site and coordinate rescue operations based on practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge."
He studied each face in the room, looking for any indication that someone possessed capabilities they hadn't yet disclosed. This is no time for modesty or protocol. If anyone here has relevant experience, combat engineering, structural collapse assessment, emergency rescue operations, I need to know now. The silence stretched as each person mentally reviewed their qualifications and found them inadequate for the crisis at hand. Admiral Pierce felt the weight of command pressing down on him as he realized that all their established systems, protocols, and hierarchies had failed precisely when they were needed most. Finally, with the desperation of someone who'd exhausted all conventional options, Admiral Pierce asked the question that would change everything. Is there a combat engineer here? Anyone with practical experience dealing with structural collapses under combat conditions?
In the back corner of the conference room, Staff Sergeant Sienna Caldwell had been listening to the increasingly desperate conversation while her mind raced through structural failure calculations she'd been running for weeks. She'd arrived at the emergency assembly after receiving the base-wide call for anyone with engineering background, knowing her presence would likely be met with the same dismissive attitudes that had characterized every interaction since her arrival at Crimson Ridge. When Admiral Pierce asked his crucial question about combat engineers, Sienna felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment she'd been unconsciously preparing for since her first day as a contractor, the intersection of dismissed expertise and desperate need that would either vindicate her professional judgment or expose her as the paranoid, overcautious veteran others believed her to be. She raised her hand with the same crisp military precision she'd maintained despite months of civilian contractor status. Sir, Staff Sergeant Sienna Caldwell, Combat Engineer Corps, 3 deployments including structural assessment and explosive ordnance disposal in Afghanistan and Iraq. Every head in the room turned toward her, and Sienna found herself looking into faces that registered everything from surprise to skepticism to barely concealed annoyance. Commander Kane's expression was particularly telling, the same patronizing look he'd worn during her dismissed infrastructure briefing, now tinged with irritation that she was inserting herself into a crisis situation above her perceived pay grade. Admiral Pierce studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in her posture, her direct gaze, and the quiet confidence with which she had identified herself. Ms. Caldwell, what's your assessment of our current situation? Sir, based on the monitoring data I've been collecting, Building 12's collapse followed the exact failure pattern I predicted in my infrastructure assessment 3 weeks ago. The eastern wall failure propagated through the structure in a zipper pattern, compromising primary load-bearing members and creating a debris field with multiple void spaces where personnel could survive. Kane's face darkened at her reference to the dismissed briefing. Ms. Caldwell, this isn't the time for... Commander? Admiral Pierce interrupted, his attention focused entirely on Sienna. Continue with your assessment. Sienna moved to the conference room's whiteboard and began sketching the building's structural layout from memory, her drawing precise enough to serve as an engineering diagram. Sir, Building 12's construction utilized a post and beam design with reinforced concrete supports. When the eastern wall collapsed, it created a domino effect, but the building's design parameters mean certain areas remained structurally sound. She marked specific locations on her sketch with the confidence of someone who'd studied the building's blueprints extensively. Based on the collapse pattern and my knowledge of the building's layout, personnel trapped in the basement mechanical spaces would have the highest survival probability. The main electrical room has reinforced walls that could create protective voids, and the water treatment area's concrete barriers would deflect debris away from workspaces. Captain Webb leaned forward, studying her diagram. How can you be so certain about the collapse pattern? The incident occurred less than an hour ago. Sir, I've been monitoring Building 12's structural integrity for 6 months using sensors that tracked stress patterns, material fatigue, and load distribution. Sienna's response was matter-of-fact, devoid of defensiveness despite the obvious implications of her unauthorized monitoring system. The failure occurred exactly where my calculations predicted it would,
following the precise timeline I projected based on progressive structural degradation. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The dismissed contractor, who'd been told to stay in her lane, had not only predicted the disaster, but had been monitoring the building's condition with sophisticated equipment that detected problems their official assessment team had missed entirely. Admiral Pierce's expression shifted from skeptical attention to intense focus. Ms. Caldwell, can you assess rescue feasibility and recommend entry points for emergency responders? Yes, sir, but I'll need to examine the actual collapse site to confirm my projections against current conditions. Sienna capped the marker and faced the Admiral directly. In Afghanistan, I conducted 17 structural assessments of buildings compromised by explosive damage. 12 of those assessments led to successful rescue operations with 0 additional casualties among rescue personnel. Torres had been monitoring radio communications throughout the discussion. Sir, emergency responders report that voices from the debris are getting weaker. The base fire chief is requesting immediate guidance about entry points and structural stability.
Time was running out, and Admiral Pierce faced the kind of command decision that defined military careers. He could wait for officially qualified personnel who wouldn't arrive for hours, or he could trust the expertise of someone whose warnings had been systematically dismissed, but whose predictions had proven devastatingly accurate. Miss Caldwell, I'm placing you in charge of structural assessment and rescue coordination. His voice carried the finality of a command decision made under extreme pressure. What do you need? The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Officers who'd spent months treating Sienna as an overcautious diversity hire were suddenly looking at her as their only hope for managing an impossible situation. The same expertise they'd dismissed as paranoid overcomplexity was now their most valuable resource for saving lives. Sir, I need immediate access to Building 12 structural blueprints, a complete equipment manifest for rescue operations, and direct communication with on-scene emergency responders. Sienna's response was crisp, professional, and completely devoid of satisfaction despite the obvious vindication of everything she'd been trying to tell them for months. Kane moved to his computer terminal, his earlier skepticism replaced by efficient cooperation. I'll pull the blueprints and equipment lists immediately. I also need confirmation of personnel assignments for Building 12's afternoon shift, Sienna continued, her mind already shifting into operational planning mode that had saved lives in combat zones. Knowing exactly who was in the building and their likely locations will help prioritize rescue operations and identify safe entry routes. Ensign Martinez consulted his personal roster. 6 individuals were assigned to Building 12 during the incident. 3 electrical technicians working on the main distribution panel, 2 maintenance personnel conducting routine equipment checks, and 1 civilian contractor performing water system analysis. Sienna nodded, already correlating personnel locations with structural damage patterns and rescue accessibility. Sir, based on the building's layout and collapse pattern, I recommend establishing 2 entry points. The western service entrance should remain structurally sound, and the emergency exit near the water treatment facility offers access to the areas where personnel are most likely to have survived. She moved back to the whiteboard and sketched rescue approach routes, her drawings showing optimal paths that avoided areas where secondary collapse was most likely. Emergency responders should avoid the central corridor entirely. That area bore the full load transfer when the eastern wall failed, and remaining structure there is critically unstable. Admiral Pierce studied her diagram with the attention of someone whose decisions would determine whether rescue operations succeeded or added to the casualty count. What about equipment requirements for rescue operations? Sir, we'll need portable structural support equipment to shore up compromised areas before rescue personnel enter. Standard rescue jacks and pneumatic supports should be sufficient for the void spaces I've identified. Sienna's response demonstrated the kind of practical knowledge that came from actual experience rather than theoretical training. We'll also need cutting equipment for clearing debris, medical supplies for treating crush injuries, and portable lighting since electrical systems throughout that section are compromised. Torres looked up from his radio communications. Ma'am, the base fire chief reports they have most of that equipment staged and ready. They're requesting immediate guidance about entry sequencing and safety protocols. Tell them I'll be on site in 5 minutes to conduct final structural assessment and coordinate entry operations. Sienna replied, already mentally shifting from planning mode to execution phase.
Admiral Pierce stood, his decision made. Miss Caldwell, you have full authority to coordinate this rescue operation. All base resources are at your disposal, and all personnel will follow your directions. As officers began dispersing to coordinate various aspects of the rescue operation, Commander Kane approached Sienna with an expression she'd never seen from him before, something that might have been respect mixed with regret. "Caldwell," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, and much more than that." "Sir, we can discuss that after we get our people out," Sienna replied, her focus already shifting to the life-and-death decisions waiting at Building 12's collapse site. For the first time since arriving at Naval Warfare Center Crimson Ridge, Staff Sergeant Sienna Frost Caldwell was exactly where she belonged, in command of a crisis situation that required every skill she'd developed during 8 years of military service. The expertise others had dismissed was about to prove whether her warnings were paranoid overcaution or prophetic accuracy. Lives hung in the balance, and finally, someone was listening.
The walk from the administrative building to Building 12's collapse site took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. But for Sienna, it felt like crossing from one universe into another. Behind her walked Admiral Pierce, Commander Kane, and several other officers who just hours earlier had dismissed her as an overcautious contractor with delusions of expertise. Now they followed her lead as she approached the most complex structural rescue operation in the base's history. The scene that greeted them was controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles surrounded the collapse site with their lights painting the debris field in alternating red and blue patterns. Firefighters, paramedics, and base security personnel maintained a perimeter around the unstable structure, while radio chatter filled the air with status reports and coordination efforts. Through it all, the sound that commanded everyone's attention was the faint but persistent calling of voices from beneath tons of concrete and twisted steel. Fire Chief Robert Daniels approached as soon as he spotted Admiral Pierce. "Sir, we've confirmed at least 4 distinct voices from different locations within the debris field. 2 from the basement level near what used to be the electrical room, 1 from the main floor area, and 1 from an unknown location that might be the mechanical space adjacent to the water treatment facility." Sienna studied the collapse site with eyes trained by years of assessing structural damage under combat conditions. The building's eastern wall had pancaked inward exactly as her calculations had predicted, creating a debris field that extended nearly 40 feet from the original foundation. But her experience told her that the catastrophic appearance was deceiving. Post and beam construction often created void spaces during collapse that could protect personnel from crushing forces. "Chief Daniels, I need your personnel to establish a secondary perimeter 50 feet back from the debris field. The remaining western wall is carrying load it wasn't designed to bear, and vibrations from rescue operations could trigger secondary collapse." The fire chief glanced at Admiral Pierce for confirmation before nodding. "Yes, ma'am. What about entry points? My teams are ready to move as soon as you give us safe approach routes." Sienna approached the debris field, stepping carefully over scattered concrete chunks and avoiding areas where dust patterns indicated recent settling. Her movements were deliberate, methodical, and informed by hard-won experience assessing structural damage under combat conditions. She knelt beside what had been the building's western service entrance, examining the doorframe and surrounding structure for signs of stress or imminent failure. "This entry point is structurally sound," she announced after a thorough visual and tactile inspection. "The doorframe shows no deformation, the surrounding concrete exhibits no fresh cracking, and the load transfer from the collapsed eastern section hasn't reached this area." She marked the location with orange spray paint from her equipment kit. "Primary entry point for rescue operations." Moving around the debris field's perimeter, she identified a second potential entry near the building's rear, where the water treatment facility's reinforced construction had created a partially protected area. "Secondary entry point here," she called, marking another location. "But approach with caution. This area will require structural shoring before personnel can safely enter." Petty Officer First Class Samuel Torres had been monitoring radio communications with trapped personnel. "Ma'am, we've established voice contact with Seaman Bell in the basement electrical room. She reports minor injuries but says the space around her is stable. She can also hear 2 other voices nearby, possibly the electrical technicians who are working on the main panel." "Can she describe her immediate surroundings?" Sienna asked, already planning rescue approach routes based on the building's original layout and collapse pattern. "She says there's a concrete beam across the entrance to her location, but there is enough space for people to move around. The area has some emergency lighting still functioning, and she doesn't smell gas or see any electrical hazards." Sienna nodded, correlating Bell's description with her mental map of the building's basement layout.
That confirms the electrical room's structural integrity. The concrete beam she's describing is probably the main support that deflected debris away from that area. She turned to Fire Chief Daniels. We can safely extract personnel from that location using the western entry point. The complexity of coordinating multiple simultaneous rescue operations while maintaining safety protocols would have challenged experienced urban rescue teams, but Sienna's combat engineering background had taught her to manage multiple variables under extreme pressure while making decisions based on incomplete information. She began organizing the rescue effort with the systematic approach that had saved lives in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Chief Daniels, I need 2 teams. Team Alpha will enter through the western service entrance and proceed directly to the basement electrical room. Team Bravo will prepare the secondary entry point with structural shoring equipment, then stand by for extraction operations in the mechanical spaces. She sketched approach routes in the dirt, showing optimal paths that avoided areas of structural instability. What about the voice from the main floor? Asked Captain Webb, who'd been monitoring radio communications from command post they'd established outside the debris field. That's our most challenging extraction, Sienna replied, studying the collapsed first floor area. The main floor took the full impact when the eastern wall failed. Whoever survived there is probably in a void space created by falling debris, which means we'll need to clear access carefully to avoid causing secondary collapse. She moved to her equipment bag and pulled out a sophisticated electronic device that looked like a combination between a stethoscope and a metal detector. This is a life detection sensor I developed during my second deployment. It can identify heartbeats and breathing patterns through debris up to 6 feet thick. Commander Kane watched with obvious interest as Sienna calibrated the device. How does it work? Combines seismic detection with infrared analysis, she explained while moving the sensor across different areas of the debris field. Human heartbeats create distinctive vibration patterns, and body heat creates thermal signatures that show up even through concrete and steel. The device began emitting soft beeping sounds as she approached the area where they'd heard voices from the main floor. Got him, she announced, marking the location with spray paint. Adult male, elevated heart rate consistent with stress but strong and regular. He's approximately 8 feet down in what appears to be a triangular void space. She studied the debris pattern above the detected location. We can reach him, but it'll require systematic debris removal and temporary shoring to prevent the void space from collapsing during extraction. Fire Chief Daniels coordinated his teams while Sienna continued her assessment of the collapse site. Her methodical approach impressed the officers who'd spent months dismissing her attention to detail as unnecessary overcautiousness. Now they watched her apply that same systematic analysis to save lives, and the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise became starkly apparent. Team Alpha, you're cleared to enter through the western service entrance. Proceed directly to the basement electrical room. Be advised that you'll encounter a concrete beam blocking the entrance, but there's sufficient space for personnel extraction. As the first rescue team entered the building, Sienna established herself as the central coordination point for all communications. Her radio crackled with status reports, equipment requests, and updates on trapped personnel conditions. She managed the flow of information with the calm efficiency of someone who'd coordinated complex operations under combat conditions. Team Alpha has visual contact with Seaman Bell, reported the team leader. She's conscious, alert, and mobile. We can see 2 additional personnel in adjacent spaces. Extraction in progress. The first successful rescue came 18 minutes after Sienna had taken command of the operation. Seaman Monica Bell emerged from the building's western entrance, supported by 2 firefighters, covered in concrete dust, but walking under her own power. Behind her came the 2 electrical technicians, both suffering minor injuries but in stable condition. Admiral Pierce approached Sienna as medical personnel attended to the rescued civilians. Outstanding work, Miss Caldwell. What's the status on remaining personnel? Sir, we've successfully extracted 3 of 6 trapped personnel. 1 additional person is confirmed alive in the main floor debris, and we're still trying to establish contact with 2 maintenance workers who were conducting equipment checks in the mechanical spaces when the collapse occurred.
The extraction of the main floor survivor required 3 hours of painstaking work that tested every skill Sienna had developed during her combat engineering career. Using a combination of pneumatic jacks, steel shoring beams, and carefully placed cutting charges, her team created a stable access tunnel through the debris field while maintaining the structural integrity of the void space, protecting the trapped maintenance worker. Corporal Austin Reed, a 24-year-old mechanic from Ohio, emerged from the building at 21:47 hours with a fractured leg and severe dehydration, but otherwise stable condition. His extraction marked a turning point in the operation. 4 of 6 trapped personnel successfully rescued, with 0 additional casualties among rescue teams. But the most challenging phase still lay ahead. The 2 remaining personnel, maintenance workers Jack Sullivan and Maria Santos, had been conducting routine checks in the building's mechanical spaces when the collapse occurred. Their location presented unique challenges because the mechanical area was situated directly beneath the building's heaviest equipment, including industrial HVAC units and water treatment machinery that had shifted during the collapse. "Ma'am," reported Fire Chief Daniels after his teams completed structural assessment of the mechanical space access points, "we're looking at extremely unstable conditions in that area. The collapse shifted approximately 40 tons of equipment off its foundations, and it's currently supported by debris that could shift with minimal disturbance." Sienna studied the mechanical space blueprints while monitoring seismic sensors she'd placed throughout the debris field. The readings showed concerning vibration patterns that indicated the shifted equipment was settling gradually, creating increasing stress on whatever debris was supporting its weight. Time was running out before secondary collapse made rescue impossible. "Chief, I need your most experienced heavy rescue specialist for this operation," she said, calculating load distributions and failure probabilities in her head. "We're going to have to stabilize 40 tons of industrial equipment while creating access to personnel trapped beneath it." The technical challenge was unlike anything Sienna had faced during her combat deployments. In Afghanistan, she dealt with buildings damaged by explosive devices, but this situation required supporting massive equipment loads while working in confined spaces where conventional shoring techniques couldn't be applied. The solution required improvisation based on engineering principles and practical experience with structural failures. Working by portable floodlights as evening turned to night, Sienna's team began the delicate process of installing support systems around the shifted equipment. Using hydraulic jacks designed for aircraft maintenance, they gradually transferred load from unstable debris to engineered support points that could bear the equipment's weight safely. Contact established with trapped personnel, Torres reported after rescue specialists managed to create a small communications opening through the debris. Both individuals are conscious and responsive. Sullivan reports chest pain consistent with rib injuries, and Santos has a suspected concussion but is mobile. The voice contact provided crucial information about conditions within the trapped space. Sullivan described their location as stable but cramped, with enough air circulation to sustain them, but rising water levels from damaged pipes that threatened to create drowning hazards within hours. The rising water added another time-critical element to an already complex rescue operation. "We need to expedite extraction," Sienna announced to her team. "Water accumulation in their location means we have maybe 4 hours before conditions become life-threatening." She studied the mechanical space layout and calculated the minimum opening size needed to extract personnel safely. "We're going to cut through the floor above their location, but we'll need to support the equipment during cutting operations." The cutting operation required coordination between multiple teams working simultaneously in a confined space where a single mistake could crush rescue personnel along with the people they were trying to save. Sienna positioned herself at the central coordination point, monitoring structural sensors while directing cutting operations with precision measured in millimeters.
"Hold cutting operations," she ordered when her sensors detected shifting in the equipment above. "Load transfer to support point 3. Adjust hydraulic pressure on jack 7 by 200 psi." The equipment stabilized and cutting operations resumed under her constant monitoring. At 02:15 hours, nearly 12 hours after the initial collapse, rescue teams established visual contact with Sullivan and Santos through the opening they'd created in the floor above the mechanical space. Both individuals were conscious, alert, and had managed to create a partially dry area within their confined space, despite rising water levels around them. The actual extraction required another 2 hours of careful work as rescue personnel maneuvered the injured workers through the confined opening while maintaining equipment stability above them. Sullivan, with his suspected rib injuries, required special handling to prevent further damage during the extraction process. Santos, despite her head injury, was able to assist with her own rescue by following specific movement instructions from the extraction team. Maria Santos emerged from Building 12 at 04:33 hours, supported by 2 rescue specialists, and immediately transferred to waiting medical personnel. Jack Sullivan followed 15 minutes later, conscious despite his injuries and expressing amazement that rescue operations had been successful given the extent of the building's collapse. As dawn broke over Naval Warfare Center, Crimson Ridge, the scene around Building 12 transformed from active rescue operations to recovery and assessment activities. All 6 trapped personnel had been successfully extracted, with no additional casualties among rescue teams. A result that professional urban rescue organizations would study as a textbook example of successful structural collapse operations. Admiral Pierce approached Sienna as she completed her final structural assessment of the site, documenting conditions for the investigation that would inevitably follow. Her uniform was covered in concrete dust. Her hands were scraped and bruised from 14 hours of hands-on rescue coordination, but her expression carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd been trained to do. "Miss Caldwell," Admiral Pierce said, his voice carrying emotions that went beyond professional respect, "I've commanded naval operations for 30 years, and I've never witnessed more professional rescue coordination under more challenging conditions. Your performance tonight saved 6 lives and prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of personnel." Sienna nodded, accepting the praise with the same professional demeanor she'd maintained throughout the crisis. "Sir, successful rescue operations depend on thorough preparation and systematic execution. The monitoring systems I'd installed provided the data needed to predict collapse patterns and identify survivor locations." "About those monitoring systems," Commander Kane interjected, approaching with an expression that mixed embarrassment with newfound respect, "I owe you more than an apology, Caldwell. Your unauthorized equipment and dismissed warnings were the only reason we were prepared for this crisis. Without your continuous monitoring data, we wouldn't have known where to look for survivors." The acknowledgement represented a complete reversal of the dismissive attitudes that had characterized Sienna's experience at Crimson Ridge. The same expertise that had been labeled paranoid overcautiousness was now recognized as the prescient preparation that had prevented a rescue operation from becoming a recovery mission. "Furthermore," Admiral Pierce continued, "your combat engineering experience proved invaluable for managing complex rescue operations under extreme conditions. The techniques you employed tonight will be incorporated into our emergency response protocols, and I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to Senior Infrastructure Consultant with full authority over base structural assessments." As emergency vehicles departed and normal base operations gradually resumed, Sienna found herself surrounded by personnel who just hours earlier had questioned her competence and qualifications. Now they sought her guidance on structural concerns, her recommendations for improving emergency response capabilities, and her assessment of other buildings that might require enhanced monitoring. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal recognition that competence transcended assumptions about gender, background, or conventional qualifications. Sienna had proven that excellence didn't require anyone's permission to exist. It simply needed the opportunity to demonstrate itself when circumstances demanded nothing less than the best available expertise. Standing in the early morning light beside the ruins of Building 12, Staff Sergeant Sienna Caldwell realized that everything had changed. She was no longer the dismissed contractor trying to prove herself worthy of respect. She had become exactly what the situation required, a leader whose expertise had saved lives when conventional approaches failed. The building that had collapsed, according to her predictions, had become the foundation for building something new. Recognition that true competence came from preparation, experience, and the courage to act when others hesitated.
3 months after the Building 12 collapse, Staff Sergeant Sienna Caldwell sat in what had once been Commander Kane's office, reviewing structural assessment reports from across Naval Warfare Center, Crimson Ridge. The nameplate on her door now read Senior Infrastructure Consultant, and her desk held 3 computer monitors displaying real-time structural data from every critical building on the base. The unauthorized monitoring system that had once been grounds for security concerns was now the foundation of the facility's comprehensive safety protocols. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of the rescue operations, Sienna found herself navigating a complex web of official investigations, media attention, and bureaucratic processes that seemed designed to convert her heroic actions into administrative paperwork. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service conducted exhaustive interviews about her monitoring equipment installation. Safety inspectors examined every aspect of the rescue operations. Congressional staffers asked detailed questions about how such catastrophic structural failure could occur at a major naval facility. Through it all, Sienna maintained the same professional demeanor that had characterized her military career. She answered questions directly, provided technical data without editorial commentary, and avoided the temptation to highlight how many warnings she'd issued that had been dismissed. Her focus remained on improving safety protocols, rather than assigning blame for past failures. The official investigation's findings vindicated every concern she'd raised during her dismissed infrastructure briefing. Building 12's collapse had indeed resulted from the exact structural weaknesses she'd identified, following the precise timeline her calculations had predicted. The investigation report specifically noted that, quote, continuous monitoring systems operated by Miss Caldwell provided the only accurate assessment of structural deterioration, enabling rapid location of trapped personnel and successful rescue operations, end quote. More significantly, the investigation revealed systemic problems with the base's infrastructure assessment protocols. Visual inspections conducted quarterly couldn't detect the gradual stress changes that preceded catastrophic failure. The approved assessment methods worked adequately for identifying obvious problems, but failed completely when dealing with subtle degradation patterns that developed over months or years. Admiral Pierce had wasted no time implementing changes based on Sienna's recommendations. Her monitoring systems were expanded to cover all critical infrastructure throughout the facility. Her emergency response protocols became standard operating procedures for structural collapse scenarios. Most importantly, her position was elevated from contractor to senior consultant with authority to override department heads when safety concerns required immediate action. The personnel changes were equally dramatic. Commander Kane had requested transfer to a logistics position where his administrative skills would be valuable, but where structural engineering decisions wouldn't fall under his authority. Master Chief Stone had retired early, citing personal reasons, but privately acknowledging that his dismissive attitudes toward technical warnings had contributed to the near catastrophe. Lieutenant Gray's replacement, Ensign Martinez, actively sought Sienna's input on all infrastructure decisions and had implemented protocols requiring her approval for any modifications to monitor buildings. The most meaningful changes weren't reflected in organizational charts or official policies. They appeared in the way personnel throughout the base interacted with Sienna and approached infrastructure concerns generally. The casual dismissals that had characterized her first months at Crimson Ridge were replaced by genuine respect for technical expertise regardless of its source. Petty Officer First Class Samuel Torres exemplified the transformation.
During a recent facilities meeting, he discovered hairline cracks in a concrete support beam and immediately contacted Sienna rather than filing a routine maintenance request. I figured if you thought it was worth investigating, it probably was, he explained when she commended his proactive approach. The same officer who'd once joked about her overcautiousness was now actively seeking her technical assessment of potential problems. The broader military community had taken notice of the Building 12 rescue operations. Sienna received invitations to speak at engineering conferences, contribute to emergency response training programs, and consult on infrastructure assessment protocols for other military facilities. Her techniques for continuous structural monitoring were being studied by civilian emergency management agencies and incorporated into building codes for critical infrastructure projects.
The media attention was more difficult to navigate. News organizations wanted dramatic stories about the heroic combat veteran who'd saved 6 lives through brilliant engineering and courage under pressure. Sienna preferred focusing on the systematic preparation and continuous monitoring that had enabled successful rescue operations, but reporters were more interested in personal narratives than technical methodologies. Hero engineer saves 6 in dramatic rescue, made for compelling headlines, but Sienna knew the real story was about the importance of listening to technical warnings regardless of their source and maintaining proper infrastructure assessment protocols. She used media interviews to advocate for improved monitoring systems and comprehensive emergency preparedness rather than promoting her personal achievements. The most satisfying recognition came from unexpected sources. Seaman Monica Bell, the first person rescued from Building 12's debris, had written a detailed letter to Admiral Pierce describing how Sienna's calm competence and systematic approach had kept trapped personnel from panicking during the rescue operations. "She never promised us everything would be okay," Bell wrote. "Instead, she told us exactly what was happening and what she was doing to get us out. That honesty and competence kept us focused on survival rather than fear." Jack Sullivan and Maria Santos, the mechanical workers extracted from the mechanical spaces, had requested permission to attend the ceremony where Sienna received official commendation for her rescue coordination efforts. Their presence served as living testimony to the effectiveness of her technical approach and professional leadership under extreme pressure. The ceremony itself reflected the complete transformation in how Sienna was perceived within the military community. Admiral Pierce presented her with the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for her rescue operations, but his remarks focused on her broader contributions to infrastructure safety and emergency preparedness. Miss Caldwell represents the kind of technical excellence and professional dedication that makes our naval forces effective, he said. Her expertise saved lives during a crisis, but her ongoing contributions to infrastructure safety will prevent future crises from occurring. Standing at attention during the ceremony, wearing the civilian equivalent of military dress uniform, Sienna felt the weight of recognition she'd worked toward throughout her military career. But the satisfaction wasn't about personal validation. It was about knowing that her expertise would be available when needed, that her warnings would be heard and evaluated on their technical merits, and that her preparation would be seen as thorough professionalism rather than paranoid overcautiousness. After the ceremony, Commander Kane approached her privately. His transfer orders would take effect the following month, but he wanted to make a personal statement before leaving Crimson Ridge. "Caldwell, I need you to understand something. My dismissive attitude toward your warnings wasn't just professional misjudgment. It was personal prejudice that could have gotten people killed. I'll carry that responsibility for the rest of my career." The apology was more thorough than Sienna had expected, and she recognized the courage it required for a senior officer to acknowledge such fundamental errors in judgment. "Commander, we're all learning from what happened. The important thing is that we improve systems and protocols so future warnings get the attention they deserve." As evening approached and the ceremony guests departed, Sienna returned to her office to review the day's monitoring data from facilities across the base. The routine was familiar now: systematic analysis of structural patterns, identification of developing concerns, and proactive coordination with maintenance teams to address problems before they became crises.
Her computer screen showed the same type of continuous data streams that had enabled her to predict Building 12's collapse and coordinate successful rescue operations. But now, those systems were integrated into official base operations, supported by adequate funding and monitored by personnel trained to recognize warning signs before they became emergencies. Outside her window, Naval Warfare Center Crimson Ridge continued its mission with the quiet efficiency of a well-managed facility. Personnel moved between buildings with confidence that structural integrity was being continuously monitored by systems designed to detect problems long before they threatened safety. Emergency response teams trained regularly using protocols developed from hard-won experience with actual structural collapse operations. The transformation was complete. Staff Sergeant Sienna Caldwell had evolved from dismissed contractor to essential technical expert, from ignored warner to trusted leader, from diversity hire to demonstrated professional whose expertise was sought throughout the military community. But the most important change wasn't in her title or recognition, it was in the knowledge that competence, when given the opportunity to prove itself, could overcome any assumption or prejudice. Excellence had found its voice, and people were finally listening.
2 years after the Building 12 collapse, Staff Sergeant Sienna Caldwell stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, delivering the keynote address for the annual Infrastructure, Security, and Emergency Response Conference. The audience included military engineers, emergency management professionals, and civilian infrastructure specialists from across the United States and allied nations. Her presentation, titled Predictive Monitoring and Crisis Leadership, Lessons from Structural Collapse Operations, had become required reading at military academies and engineering schools worldwide. The collapse of Building 12 at Naval Warfare Center Crimson Ridge was entirely preventable, Sienna began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through the consequences of ignored warnings. Every structural failure indicator was detected, documented, and reported through official channels months before catastrophic failure occurred. The question we must address isn't how the collapse happened, but why technical warnings were systematically dismissed until crisis made them impossible to ignore. Her presentation wasn't a personal vindication narrative, but a systematic analysis of organizational failures that prevented technical expertise from reaching decision-makers effectively. She used the Crimson Ridge incident as a case study for broader problems within military and civilian infrastructure management, focusing on systemic solutions rather than individual blame assignments. The audience listened with rapt attention as she described the gradual stress pattern changes that preceded structural failure, the mathematical models that accurately predicted collapse timelines, and the monitoring technologies that enabled successful rescue operations. But her emphasis remained on institutional changes needed to prevent similar incidents rather than celebrating her personal role in managing the crisis. Competent technical analysis exists throughout our organizations, she explained, advancing to a slide showing infrastructure assessment data for military facilities worldwide. The challenge isn't finding expertise, it's creating systems that ensure technical warnings reach decision-makers without being filtered through assumptions about credibility based on rank, gender, or conventional career progression. The transformation at Crimson Ridge had become a model for military facilities throughout the Department of Defense. Sienna's continuous monitoring protocols were being implemented at naval bases, Army installations, and Air Force facilities across the globe. Her emergency response methodologies were incorporated into standard operating procedures for structural collapse scenarios. Most significantly, her approach to technical assessment, systematic data collection, continuous monitoring, and predictive modeling was changing how military organizations evaluated infrastructure safety. But the personal transformation was equally profound. Sienna had evolved from a dismissed contractor struggling for basic professional respect into one of the military's most sought-after experts on infrastructure security and emergency response.
Her expertise was requested for congressional testimony, international conferences, and high-level policy discussions about military infrastructure priorities and funding allocations. The professional recognition came with responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. Young engineers sought her mentorship, particularly women entering fields where their competence might be questioned based on assumptions rather than evaluated on technical merits. She had established an unofficial network of military engineers who shared technical concerns and supported each other through bureaucratic resistance to their recommendations. "Excellence doesn't require permission" had become her signature phrase during mentoring sessions with junior personnel. It simply requires preparation, persistence, and the courage to maintain professional standards even when others question your judgment. The phrase resonated with personnel throughout the military who'd experienced their own versions of dismissed expertise and bureaucratic resistance to technical recommendations. Sienna's story provided a template for overcoming institutional inertia through demonstrated competence, rather than confrontational approaches that typically failed to change organizational attitudes.
Commander Kane's replacement, Captain Jennifer Walsh, had implemented protocols that institutionalized the lessons learned from Building 12's collapse. Technical warnings were now evaluated on their mathematical and scientific merits, rather than filtered through assumptions about the source's credibility. Monitoring systems were considered essential, rather than optional, and predictive analysis was integrated into all infrastructure planning processes. The broader military community had embraced these changes with enthusiasm that surprised senior leadership. Personnel at every level appreciated working in environments where technical competence was recognized, regardless of its source, and where safety protocols were based on comprehensive data rather than bureaucratic convenience. Seaman Monica Bell, now a petty officer second class and pursuing a degree in structural engineering, attended Sienna's War College presentation. After the formal session, she approached her former rescuer with a question that reflected the ongoing impact of that crisis experience. "Ma'am, how do you maintain confidence in your technical judgment when authority figures dismiss your analysis?" Bell asked. "I'm encountering similar situations in my current assignment, and I'm struggling with whether to push harder or accept that my concerns aren't being taken seriously." Sienna's response reflected wisdom gained through years of navigating organizational resistance to technical expertise. "Petty Officer Bell, your responsibility is to provide accurate technical analysis and communicate it clearly through appropriate channels. Whether others accept your conclusions isn't within your control, but the quality of your work and the thoroughness of your documentation is entirely your responsibility." She paused, studying the young engineer's earnest expression. "Document everything. Maintain professional standards regardless of others' attitudes. And remember that competence eventually proves itself, though sometimes it requires patience you'd prefer not to exercise." The advice had become a cornerstone of Sienna's approach to professional development and organizational change. Rather than fighting institutional resistance directly, she'd learned to let demonstrated competence overcome assumptions gradually, while maintaining her own standards regardless of external recognition. Her office at Crimson Ridge now served as an informal center for military engineering excellence, where personnel from across the Department of Defense sought guidance on complex technical problems and organizational challenges. The same building where she'd once struggled for basic professional respect had become a destination for the military's most promising engineers. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. Jack Sullivan, the maintenance worker rescued from Building 12's mechanical spaces, had completed emergency medical technician training and frequently credited Sienna's calm leadership during his rescue for inspiring his career change into emergency services. Maria Santos had pursued additional education in structural engineering and now works as a civilian contractor, specializing in infrastructure assessment for military facilities.
"You showed us that competence and preparation matter more than panic," Santos explained during a recent visit to Sienna's office. "That lesson applies to every emergency situation I encounter now."
The ripple effects extended beyond individual career changes. Building 12's site had been rebuilt using advanced monitoring systems and redundant safety features that reflected lessons learned from the collapse. The new facility served as a demonstration project for military construction standards and emergency response protocols developed through hard-won experience. As Sienna concluded her War College presentation, she reflected on the journey from dismissed contractor to recognized expert and the broader lessons that experience provided about organizational change and professional excellence. The Building 12 collapse taught us that technical expertise exists throughout our organizations, but institutional barriers often prevent that expertise from reaching decision makers effectively, she said, addressing the packed auditorium. Our responsibility as technical professionals is to maintain the highest standards of competence and communication, regardless of how others initially respond to our recommendations. Her final slide displayed a photograph of Naval Warfare Center Crimson Ridge's rebuilt facilities, showing the integration of monitoring systems and safety protocols that had emerged from crisis. Excellence finds a way to prove itself, but it requires practitioners who refuse to lower their standards when faced with skepticism or resistance. The question isn't whether your competence will be recognized. It's whether you'll maintain that competence long enough for recognition to matter. The standing ovation that followed reflected more than appreciation for an engaging presentation. It represented recognition from the military engineering community that Sienna had articulated something they'd all experienced: the challenge of maintaining professional excellence in organizations that sometimes struggled to recognize competence when it appeared in unexpected forms. As audience members approached with questions and comments after her presentation, Sienna realized that her individual story had become part of a larger narrative about organizational change and the importance of listening to technical expertise regardless of its source. The transformation that began with dismissed warnings and catastrophic failure had evolved into systemic improvements that would protect personnel for decades to come. Staff Sergeant Sienna Caldwell had proven that sometimes all it takes is one moment when competence matters more than assumptions, when results speak louder than prejudice, and when preparation meets opportunity to change not just individual careers, but entire organizational cultures. Excellence had indeed found its voice, and the echo would resonate throughout the military community for generations to come.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.